Muy bien, muchas gracias. Entonces, en unos minutos se habilita la opción de la interpretación. Y sin más, pues vamos a dar inicio a nuestra actividad. Mi nombre es Alejandra Porras. Yo soy coordinadora de los temas de medidas sanitarias y fitosanitarias y obstáculos técnicos al comercio del Ministerio de Comercio Exterior de Costa Rica. Formo parte, además, del subcomité de medidas sanitarias y fitosanitarias del Acuerdo de Asociación que está vigente entre Centroamérica y la Unión Europea.
Alejandra, disculpa, es que no me han habilitado todavía la interpretación. Ya se habilitó el feature, pero no me han habilitado de intérprete aún.
Ah, muy bien. Entonces, demos un minuto para que se haga la habilitación. Tal vez me indica Johnny en el momento que queda Roxana habilitada.
Sí, un segundo, por favor.
Y de momento voy dándole los buenos días a la gente que nos va saludando en el chat. Por acá veo gente conocida. Muy buenos días a todos. Rocío, Máximo, Liliana, Andrea, Cristian, don Marco Vinicio, Jiménez, un gusto saludarlo. Buenos días desde Guatemala. Bueno, nos acompañan personas de toda la región centroamericana y de la Unión Europea. Buenos días, Andrés. Las presentaciones, la de Germán de fijo va a ser en inglés. La presentación de Luis, Luis, ¿la vas a hacer en español o en inglés?
Yo la tenía preparada en inglés, en principio sería en inglés.
Perfecto. Entonces ambas presentaciones son en inglés y para eso tenemos entonces la opción de la interpretación que está siendo habilitada en este momento. Muy buenos días, Olivier. Un gusto saludarte. Saludos desde Nicaragua. Acá veo la Asociación de Productores Independientes de Banano de Guatemala. Muy buenos días. Muchísimas gracias. Creo que ya quedó habilitada la interpretación. Ya está habilitada, perfecto, muy bien. Entonces, bueno, prosigo con la introducción de la actividad. Como les decía, es un seminario que se ha propuesto e ideado desde la labor que hacemos en el Subcomité de Medidas Sanitarias y Fitosanitarias del Acuerdo de Asociación entre Centroamérica y la Unión Europea. Es nuestro propósito, pues, traer ese conocimiento que tienen en la Unión Europea en relación con el análisis de riesgo de agroquímicos, que es fundamental para la producción agrícola, el incremento de nuestra exportación al mercado europeo y el sostenimiento de nuestras exportaciones a este mercado, y por eso pues es uno de los temas a los que le hemos dado una absoluta prioridad. Quisiera agradecer a Joaquín Ordeica, a quien voy a dar la palabra, representante de la Unión Europea en el subcomité. Y bueno, recordar que este es un trabajo que hacemos en seguimiento de la presidencia pro tempore que tuvo Costa Rica del Sistema de Integración Económica Centroamericana y que coordinamos también con Guatemala, quien es en este momento la presidencia pro tempore. Entonces, bueno, sin más, Joaquín, te doy la palabra para tus palabras de bienvenida y pues posteriormente estaremos entrando directo al tema que venimos esta mañana. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Alejandra, y buenos días a todo el mundo, a todos los participantes. Bienvenidos, también en nombre de la Unión Europea y en particular de la Comisión Europea, de GESANTE, y también de la Autoridad Europea de Seguridad Alimentaria, la EFSA, que va a tener un papel, nuestros colegas hoy van a tener un papel fundamental en este seminario. Para nosotros es también mucha satisfacción, nos da mucha satisfacción poder participar y poder organizar este seminario. Lo consideramos también una parte de nuestra contribución al buen funcionamiento del acuerdo y al buen funcionamiento del subcomité. Yo, como decía Alejandra, soy Joaquín Ordeic Vila, funcionario de la Comisión Europea, de GESANTE, y la contraparte de Alejandra y de los colegas de América Central en el subcomité. una pequeña introducción respecto a quienes van a hacer la presentación, que son nuestros colegas Luis y Hermine, de la Autoridad Europea de Seguridad Alimentaria, EFSA. Para los participantes, una pequeña explicación sobre qué es la EFSA. La EFSA es una autoridad independiente de la Unión Europea, un organismo independiente que se encarga de dar apoyo científico, técnico, a las instituciones europeas, y en este caso a nosotros, a la Comisión Europea, respecto a materias de seguridad alimentaria o inocuidad alimentaria, como dicen ustedes, y es una institución fundamental porque nos da el apoyo científico y técnico, y precisamente por eso son ellos los que hoy van a ser protagonistas, porque vamos a hablar de lo que es la parte de evaluación del riesgo, de qué es lo que hay detrás de cuando la Unión Europea modifica un estatus sobre una sustancia activa para ser utilizada en plaguicidas, o cuando recomienda un límite máximo determinado. Ellos nos van a dar una explicación sobre cuáles son las bases técnico-científicas que hay detrás de eso, y también sobre el procedimiento. Y ya nada más, Alejandra, agradecer también los esfuerzos que habéis hecho vuestra parte para la organización, tanto técnicos como logísticos, que realmente apreciamos, y que sin ellos no hubiese sido posible llegar a los participantes. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Joaquín. Yo únicamente reitero que en el chat se pueden hacer las consultas por escrito. Después de cada presentación tendremos un espacio para tomar algunas de las preguntas. Iniciamos con la presentación de Luis Carrasco. Él tiene en su primera presentación un espacio de 40 minutos. Luis, cuando falten unos 3-4 minutos, yo abro la cámara para que sepas que estamos cerca de concluir tus primeros 40 minutos. Y sin más, entonces, adelante. Gracias.
Buenas tardes desde Europa, buenos días en Centroamérica. Como han dicho, mi nombre es Luis Carrasco Cabrera, soy oficial científico de la unidad de pesticidas en la EFSA, y mi primera presentación será, un momento por favor que estoy intentando compartir la pantalla. Mi primera presentación será acerca del el marco regulatorio. Mi primera presentación será, acerca del marco regulatorio y del proceso para establecer los niveles máximos de residuo de pesticidas. Y como se acordó, with your permission, from now on, I will talk in English. Can you all see my screen with the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
So, in this presentation, I will briefly touch about the general regulation in Europe, the food law, and the role of EFSA in that regulatory framework. I will touch a little bit more upon the two relevant regulations for pesticides in Europe, which are the Regulation 1107 from 2009 on the approval of the active substances, and the Regulation 396 on the pesticide residue levels. Then I will also give you the link to the guidance documents that we follow in the EU, which are relevant for pesticide residues. And also I will talk, of course, about the MRL setting process and the scientific studies behind. Then very briefly, the foundational regulation of EFSA is the Regulation 1178 from 2002. This is called in Europe the General Food Law. And it establishes that the legislation should be based on scientific risk assessment. And it establishes EFSA as an independent agency providing scientific advice to the EU legislator. So we are an independent scientific agency in the EU. And also in this general food law, the separation between risk assessment and risk management processes is clearly defined. Then the general food law was amended recently in 2019 by the Regulation 1381, which is also called Transparency Regulation, which, among other things, allows citizens to have direct access to scientific studies and information submitted to us, to EFSA, and based on those studies, we do the risk assessment. Then, as I said, in the EU legislation on food safety, there is a clear separation between the risk assessment and the risk management processes. And in EFSA, we are the risk assessors. And as such, we provide independent scientific advice and support for EU risk managers and policymakers on food and feed safety. We do it independently, and we also provide timely risk communication. And we also promote scientific cooperation. On the side, on the risk managers, they develop the food safety regulation, and they implement the legislation, they adopt the regulation, and they also enforce the food safety legislation. So how do we ensure in Europe that the pesticides are safe for the European consumers? I would like to present you this link. I hope you can all see the link now. So before I start with the workflow, it's very important to distinguish between active substance and pesticide. The pesticide is the formulate, and it's are the chemical compounds that are used to protect the crops by killing or controlling the pest. The active substance is the key ingredient, the essential ingredient of the pesticide. Okay, so and in Europe, the approval of the active substance is done at European level, while the authorization of the pesticide is done at national level. But we are going to see it with this workflow. So if a company wants to submit an application for the approval of an active substance, they refer to a member state. They send the application to a member state, which is called the rapporteur member state. And in this application, all the studies, all the scientific evidence should be there. Then the member state, which is called in the process rapporteur member state, will evaluate the application and will prepare the draft assessment report there. And that report is sent to EFSA, and then EFSA will launch the peer review process in collaboration with experts from EU member states. Then, based on the conclusions of the EFSA peer review, the European Commission and the member states, so the legislators, the managers, will decide whether they authorize the active substance in Europe. Then, if the active substance is authorized, it might be that the company applies to put the pesticide containing the approved active substance on the European market. Then the industry will prepare an application that will be sent to a member state. In this case, it's called evaluating member state. And the application contains a proposal for the maximum residue level. Then, if the proposed MRL is covered by the current EU legislation, then the application goes directly to the European Commission. However, if this is not the case, then it comes to EFSA, and EFSA will assess the proposed MRL, will draft a scientific opinion, and will pass that opinion to the European Commission. And based on that, the European Commission will decide whether to accept the proposed MRL or not. Then, if it is authorized, if the European Commission accepts the MRLs, then the member state can authorize the pesticide. For the pesticide authorization, Europe is divided in 3 climatic zones because they are where the agricultural practices are similar, and also the environmental climatic conditions, and the principle of mutual recognition applies for countries of the same zone. Then the company brings the pesticide to the market. The member states will monitor the use of the pesticide on the market, and they will also participate in the EU coordinated programs for monitoring the pesticides residues in food. Then the member states send the data of the monitoring programs to EFSA, and EFSA will draft the annual report on pesticide residues in food. That report may contain a proposal to review the MRLs, and then the European Commission with the member states will consider the MRL proposals for approval. And this is how the whole cycle is working in Europe. Then going back to my presentation. So here on the left, on my right, you can see again the process in a nutshell. So for the approval, the overreaching legislation is the regulation 1107/2009, where it is established that we have to do a full assessment of the representative uses for the active substance, which means that we have to assess the physical chemical properties, the analytical methods, toxicological properties, of course, the residual behavior and the dietary intake, but also the fate and behavior of the substance in the environment and the ecotoxicology. Then the authorization of the plant protection product is done at national level. For that, we need to define the good agricultural practices. We will see later on, but they are the intended uses for the pesticide. The amendment of the EU MRLs are done under the regulation 396/2005. If the existing MRLs are not sufficient to cover the new uses, that regulation has three very important articles for us because they define part of the workflows that we have in EFSA. So for the MRL setting, modification, and for the evaluation of import tolerances, which is very relevant for the audience today, we have the Article 10. Then for the MRL review is the Article 12. Under the MRL review, there is no real application. It is triggered by the legislation that once the substance is approved, there is the need to review all the authorized uses. And then also under Article 43, we have the preparation of the EFSA position to the CCPR. And finally, once the substance is approved, then the pesticide authorized and brought to the market, then there is the post-marketing monitoring, which is under the Article 32 of the Regulation 396. Tackling more the risk assessment process, risk assessment is a scientifically based process that, to assess the risk resulting from the expected exposure to a chemical. In this case, the chemical is the pesticide. So if we are here as consumers, we need to assess all the sources of exposure of the pesticide. And then the most intuitive one is that I have a field, in this case a maize field, which has been treated with a pesticide containing an authorized active substance in the EU. Then in the edible part of that maize, we may have residues at a certain level. And then, this may be a route of exposure for us. But we don't only eat maize raw, it can be hydrolyzed in order to produce, for example, popcorn, also flour, and we also need to assess the exposure via the processed commodities. Also, when the substance was applied, it might be that the substance reaches the soil. In that case, depending on the mobility and on the persistence of the substance in the soil, it can be uptaken by the next crop planted in rotation after maize. For example, another cereal, and then in that case, we may also be exposed to residues from rotational crops. Maize, but also apple, is an item, a commodity that we can eat directly, but also can be used to as a feeding item to livestock. And then in that case, we also need to assess the residues in the animal commodities and to see if they are transferred to the animal products, like, for example, milk. So this is, at a glance, the whole principle of the risk assessment that we do in EFSA. So for the guidelines here, this is the link where you can find all the guidelines that are applicable in Europe under the regulation and the data requirements under the regulation 1107 and the 396. I'm not going to visit the link in sake of the time. But the main guidelines are related to metabolism in plants, because we need to know the nature of the residues in the plants, primary and rotational crops, storage stability studies, processing studies in case the commodity is hydrolyzed. Of course, the calculation of the maximum residue levels, which are linked to the empirical data coming from the supervised residue trials for rotational crops and for primary crops. And for the animals, we also need metabolism studies in animals and livestock feeding studies. Again, I repeat, this is the link where you can find all the relevant information. So touching, let's say, more the topic of this presentation are the steps in the MRL assessment. Here are the steps in a very simple way. In this presentation, so everything starts with the identification of the good agricultural practices, which are the intended uses, and ends up with the legal implementation. In this presentation, I will cover the first 3 steps, and the assessment for the consumers will be done in the 3rd presentation of today. So the good agricultural practice means, excuse me, the nationally recommended, authorized, or registered safe use of a pesticide under agricultural conditions. So basically are the instructions that are in the label of the container of the pesticide. The GAP defines the application rate of the substance, the number of applications per growing season, a very important parameter, which is the minimum time interval before the harvest, what means the days that pass between we apply the active substance and then the crop is harvested. The growth stage at which the crop is, of the crop at which the active substance is applied, and the method of application is not the same to have foliar treatment or seed treatment or soil treatment, for example. And the GAP should reflect the practical conditions at which the desired effect is reliably obtained with the minimum dose, because we also follow the principle of the minimum dose of the pesticide possible. Then for a given crop in a climatic zone, so the South and the Northern Europe, we may have different GAPs authorized for the same crop. And then we need to identify the critical one, which is the agricultural practice that leads to the highest residue levels. If no GAP is notified or assessed, then the default MRL, which is set at the LOQ, usually 0.01 is milligram per kilogram, is established. That LOQ is in most of the cases, but it can be lower, for example, if the substance is very toxic, or higher if we are talking about a substance for which the LOQ is a combined one of different compounds. This is how a GAP table looks like. So we have the crop, the area in the EU, if it is South or Northern Europe, then whether the substance is applied in the open field or in a greenhouse. Then the pest, details about the formulation, what is very important for us, the method of application, in this case for a spray, the growth stage at which the substance is applied. It is not the same to have a pre-emergence application than to have an application once the edible part of the crop is formed. The number of applications, the dose rate, very important for us, and the unit. We usually request to have the units expressed as gram of active substance per hectare. And the PHI, which, as I said, is the interval between the application of the substance and the harvest. Then, if I present you a table like this, good to be able to tell me which one is the most critical GAP. We have a couple of GAPs for the Southern Europe, couple of GAPs for the Northern Europe, all of them on apples, and all of them with foliar treatment. So we need to compare them and among the two of the South to select the most critical one, so the one leading to the highest residues, and the same for the North. In this case, for the South, the most critical one is this one, because the number of applications are the same in both of them. The application rate is also the same, but the pre-harvest interval is 7 days in this case, 3 in this case. So we presume that the residues will be higher if we apply the active substance and we harvest after 3 days than if we do after 7 days. And for the North, here we have a higher number of applications, a higher number of application rate, and also a shorter PHI. So in this case, this gap is clearly more critical. This is for good agricultural practices in Europe, but when the good agricultural practices is from a third country, so a country outside the EU, then we assess them as import tolerances. And in that case, for example, if we get an application for an import tolerance from Morocco, we will assess different to the other gaps. So once we have identified our intended use, we need to define the residue, which is the hazard identification and the hazard characterization, more or less. So I go back to the maize field treated with a pesticide containing an approved active substance. And then we want to know in the edible part of the crop, which chemical compounds do I have? It's only the parent, so what I applied is the parent plus any metabolite. Did the parent completely degrade and I don't have any more? And then I see the products of the degradation. And for that, we need to assess the metabolism studies. They have to be representative of the intended uses. They are performed with radio-labeled active substance on each relevant moiety. Then in the studies, the radioactivity should be followed in all parts of the crop, because we need, okay, for the edible part, but it might be that for animals, the stover of the maize is important. So we also need to follow the radioactivity in other parts of the crops. Of course, they have to quantify the total radioactivity and identify, characterize the main components of the residue. And after the assessment of the metabolism studies, we will be capable to derive the residue definition for enforcement and the residue definition for risk assessment. So, and this is a very important concept. For enforcement, we need the good marker, and we try to keep the residue definition for enforcement as simple as possible, as long as it is enough. So we have a sufficient marker for the residues. And this is the one relevant for the MRL. While for risk assessment, we need to consider all the significant and toxicologically relevant compounds. And this is relevant to assess the consumer exposure. So this is a table of metabolism studies performed with substance X on 3 different crop groups. We have apples, lettuces, and wheat. Apples and lettuce following for the treatment, wheat seek treatment, and those are the results expressed as percentage of the total radioactive residues. Then, in this case, we need to see out of the compounds identify and characterize which one are relevant for us. So we consider that a chemical species or chemical compound is relevant in the metabolism studies when it represents more than 10% of the TRR, and it is quantified at levels higher than 0.01 milligram equivalent per kilogram. So with this example, the parent is the main component of the residue. It is up to 60% in apples, 80% in lettuce, 45% in wheat. And there is also this metabolite at higher rates than 10% TRR, while the metabolite 2 and the other compounds are not significant. And then in this case, we will include parent in the residue definition for enforcement, because it is a good marker, the main component of the residue. And then the metabolite 1, depending on its toxicity, will be considered for inclusion in the residue definition for risk assessment together with the parent. So for enforcement, only the parent; for risk assessment, parent and metabolite 1, depending on the toxicity. And the last step is how to estimate the maximum residue levels, the MRLs. So as per definition in the Regulation 396/2005, maximum residue level is the upper legal level of a concentration for a pesticide residue in or on food or feed set in accordance with this regulation based on good agricultural practices. So the principle we already saw, and the lowest consumer exposure necessary to protect vulnerable consumers. It is derived from the enforcement, so the compounds, the markers, the compounds included in the residue definition for enforcement. And the levels come from the supervised residue trials. And there are data requirements depending on whether the crop is considered major or minor crop. The details are given in this guideline. Here you have the link for the data requirements, comparability and extrapolation rules. I cannot enter into detail, but just to let you know that in order to know the concentration levels of the residues in the plants, we need to perform the supervised residue trials. Then the MRL is derived for a specific commodity, for example, wheat, but extrapolations are possible according to certain rules that you can also find in this document. It is expressed in milligram per kilogram, and something very important, we follow the ALARA principle, so it should be as low as reasonably achievable to enforce misuses. It is not a toxicological value, and it should be checked for consumer safety. So how to set the MRLs? For that, we follow the internationally agreed methodology of the OECD. Here you have the link to the guideline and the calculator. Let's say that for a given compound applied on apples, it's important to know the enforcement LOQ, in this case 0.05, and then we need to introduce the set of residue trials, the results in milligram per kilogram here and here for enforcement and for risk assessment. In this case, the set are the same because the residue definition for enforcement and for risk assessment is the same. But if for risk assessment we have an expanded, let's say, residue definition with more metabolites, then the residue for risk assessment will be higher. And then the calculator will give us three numbers or three parameters. The first one is the highest residue. We need to look at the highest residue as a floor to guarantee that the MRL is higher than the highest residue found in the residue trials. Then we will also have the mean plus 4 times the standard deviation, and this is the value. And also another method called about 3 times the mean. And it is called about because here there is a correction factor, this is according to OECD, in order to take into account the residue levels which are below the LOQ. In this case, we don't have any, but because those levels below the LOQ are considered as sensor values. And then for the MRL, according to the OECD, we should take the highest of the 3 values. So in this case, is the mean plus 4 times the standard deviation, 0.89. And then if you visit this link, you will see that there is a table with the rounded up rules, because at the end, the MRL is rounded up to 0.90. As I said, this is agreed internationally at OECD level. And then for the risk assessment, we need 2 important parameters, the HR, which is the highest residue, and the STMR, which is the estimated median residue. This is for the plant. Then for the livestock, we will also need to assess the residue levels and to set MRLs. In that case, there are 3 important concepts for us. The first one is the dietary burden. It's a calculation also done according to the OECD agreed methodology, in which we will estimate the dietary exposure to the pesticide of livestock. And then depending on that, if a certain trigger value also defined by the OECD is triggered, sorry, a threshold value is triggered or not, then we need to investigate the metabolism data and the feeding studies with a very simple diagram. So we have again our maize, which was treated with the active substance. And by doing the calculation of the dietary burden, we will estimate how much residues expressed in milligram per kilogram body weight per day of the animal may intake. Then if that level exceeds a threshold, then we need to investigate the nature of the residues in the animal, so the metabolism studies in animals. To see if, again, we have only the parent, we have metabolites which are relevant, we will set residue definitions for enforcement and for risk assessment in the animals. And we will also assess whether the residues were transferred to animal products, like, for example, the milk. And then, based on the feeding studies, we will set MRLs also for animals. And just to finalize my presentation, two very important links for you about the official journal of the European Commission, where you can find all the regulations for pesticides. And this is the database of the European Commission with the list of available MRLs, applicable MRLs for all the approved active substances in Europe. And with that, I have finalized my presentation. Thank you very much. And now, if you have questions, I'm very glad to reply.
Muchas gracias, Luis. Excelente el manejo del tiempo. De hecho, nos dejó un poco más de minutos de lo que habíamos previsto para la sección de preguntas. Sí tenemos algunas preguntas. Cristian pregunta, dice, ¿el proceso presentado desde cuándo es válido como tal? Si se hace todo esto, entonces, ¿por qué se hace la remoción de una molécula después? No sé si es clara la pregunta.
La segunda parte no, perdona. ¿Por qué se hace?
La remoción de una molécula después. Tal vez Cristian nos podría elaborar un poco más la pregunta para poder entenderla un poco mejor. Bueno, nos dicen que si vamos a compartir la presentación, creo que no hay ningún inconveniente en compartir las presentaciones y además estamos grabando la actividad. Rocío pregunta, un momento por favor, dice, cuando se evalúa un límite máximo de residuos en un producto como banano, si se evalúa la totalidad del producto, incluyendo la cáscara o únicamente la pulpa del banano, por ejemplo. Creo que esta pregunta de Rocío es muy apropiada porque muchas veces surge la duda de si el límite es en relación con el residuo de la cáscara, pero ¿qué pasa con aquellos productos que son para consumo sin la cáscara? Perdón. Y además veo que Joaquín levantó la mano, entonces no sé si él querrá también intervenir. Pero bueno, si les parece, quedemos con esta pregunta de Rocío y después avanzamos con otras de las preguntas. Joaquín, por favor, siéntete libre de intervenir cuando lo consideres.
No, disculpa, Alejandra, fue un accidente de cursor. Le di por accidente a levantar la mano. Disculpa.
Muy bien. Ok, Luis, ¿tenés algún comentario en relación con la medición del LMR en la cáscara de aquellos alimentos que no se consumen con cáscara?
El MRL se aplica al fruto, pero luego se establece lo que se llama peeling factor, un factor de pelado. Entonces se tienen que hacer estudios en total, cuánto hay digamos, en la pulpa de la banana, por así decirlo, y cuánto hay en la cáscara. Y entonces se establece, mediante una división, un factor de lo que se llama un peeling factor.
Ok, muy bien. Hay otra pregunta.
Igual que el MRL, perdona, siempre se establece para la sustancia, o sea, para el producto crudo, raw commodity.
Ok.
Y también con factores de procesado se evalúa, por ejemplo, si es para cereal, cuánto hay en el cereal, en el grano tal cual, y cuánto habría, por ejemplo, en la harina. Entonces tiene que hacer un estudio con un factor de procesado. Ok,
entonces siempre se toma en cuenta el factor del producto que no se consume con la cáscara. O sea, es uno de los factores que se evalúa y lo mismo mencionas en el caso de que el producto sea procesado.
Sí, pero eso es para el Risk Assessment, lo que es el MRL es para el producto tal cual.
Ok, perfecto. Muy bien. Vamos a ver aquí, Cristian nos elaboró un poco más la pregunta. Inicialmente él decía el proceso presentado desde cuándo es válido como tal. Y luego dice, ¿por qué se hace después la evaluación para sacarlo de uso? y no permitir la importación de productos de otros países. Me parece que, aquí voy a hacer yo un comentario, me parece que lo que Cristian se refiere es que por un lado, cuando se evalúan sustancias para decidir si se renueva o no la autorización del uso de un agroquímico, luego se prohíbe la importación de productos que contengan ese agroquímico, pero creo que lo que pasa es que se hace una reducción del límite máximo de residuos como producto de que la sustancia no es autorizada más en el mercado de la Unión Europea y por ende afecta la importación. Me parece que esto es lo que la relación que Cristian hace. No sé si tienes algún comentario ahí. Siempre que se desautoriza una sustancia o un agroquímico, o sea, necesariamente se va a reducir el límite máximo de residuos.
Quizá para esto mi compañera Hermín podría responder mejor porque ella es más experta en la importación. En cuanto a desde cuándo es vigente, la regulación es desde 2009, la 1107, pero a su vez sustituye a otra que es anterior. Pero sí que es verdad que la aprobación de la sustancia es para 10 años inicialmente. Pero cuando se reevalúa, si durante esos 10 años hay nuevos estudios que dan lugar a nuevos valores toxicológicos de referencia, o sobre todo si hay estudios acerca de si la sustancia es un endocrine disruptor, un disruptor endocrino debe ser. Entonces se vuelve a reevaluar. Entonces por eso son 10 años y se vuelve a reevaluar a los 10 años sistemáticamente para cada sustancia.
Ok, perfecto.
Y en cuanto a lo del MRL para el import tolerance, le doy la palabra a mi compañera Hermine.
Germán, ¿querías hacer algún comentario sobre esta pregunta?
Well, I think we will come to this topic in my next presentation. Maybe we can take it, I will try to address it in the presentation then.
Perfect, so just leave it for a little bit later and I will take some other questions. Vamos a ver, por acá hay varias. Está bastante activo la sección de preguntas y respuestas. Claramente es un tema de muchísimo interés para la región. Vamos a ver, pregunta José Andrés si existen límites máximos de residuos para jugos concentrados, como por ejemplo piña, o si los análisis se comparan con los límites máximos de residuos de fruta fresca. Veo que pregunta por el límite máximo en un producto ya procesado, por ejemplo.
Como he dicho, el límite máximo de residuo es en el raw commodity, en el producto tal cual.
Fresco. Producto fresco.
Eso es. Sí.
No se hace medición del límite máximo de residuos en el producto procesado, entonces.
Se hace y se calcula un factor de procesado, pero el que viene recogido en el reglamento europeo es sobre el producto fresco.
Ok, muy bien, gracias. Germán, adelante, por favor.
Yes, no, just to add on this question, as Luis just explained, the MRLs are established for the unprocessed products as they are placed on the market. For processed products, they must be produced from compliant unprocessed products, and to calculate the MRL that is applicable for the processed products, these processing factors are relevant. But this is something that, there's a database available on processing factors for that need to be taken into account. Unfortunately, there is not a complete list yet for processing factors, but the basic principle is if you don't have a processing factor, you need to demonstrate that the unprocessed product was compliant with the EU standards on pesticides. So I think that's just to clarify this point.
Yes, thank you very much. Muy útil esta explicación, muy importante porque también veo varias preguntas que se relacionan con lo mismo. Nuevamente preguntando sobre límites máximos de residuos en subproductos, por ejemplo, aceite de naranja, cuestiones de este tipo. Entonces, bueno, creo que ya es una pregunta aclarada, muy relevante tomar en cuenta el cumplimiento de los límites del producto que se utilice como materia prima o del producto fresco, a partir del cual se extrae algún subproducto. Vamos a ver por acá, todavía tenemos un par de minutos más para preguntas. Hay una pregunta muy general, igualmente la voy a hacer para Neiva. Ella dice, hola, tengo entendido que, por ejemplo, en banano no se permite que haya más de 5 tipos de residuos de diferentes moléculas cuando se importa en Europa, a pesar de que estos residuos se encuentran por debajo de las tolerancias de importación permitidas, o sea, que cumplen el límite. ¿Por qué se debe esto o a qué se debe esto? ¿Tienes algún comentario, Luis o Germán?
Maybe Hermine, would you mind to comment on that?
Well, I'm not sure whether I fully got the question right.
Sí.
So the basic principle is that food needs to comply with the individual MRLs. So if we have several different MRLs in bananas for different active substances, the imported banana, but also bananas that are produced in Europe, we have some banana producing places in Europe, they must comply with all the legal limits that apply to banana. Banana with a peel. MRLs are established for the product as placed on the market. For the risk assessment, we take into account that people do not eat the peel. So there we would take into account that the exposure is lower than eating the banana with the peel. I'm not sure whether this is really addressing your question, but we do not set MRLs for, so to say, summing up MRLs from different active substances, so they need to comply individually with the MRLs established.
Yes, thank you. You addressed the question. I think that she's asking that there cannot be used more than 5 different pesticides. And I don't think that there is a limit, a given limit on it. Is just the ones that are authorized for each product, and they have to fulfill with the LMR.
Well, there may be some private standards, that maybe some importers request that a product may not contain more than 5 different pesticides. Okay. But this is not established in the EU food legislation. This is a private standards that are established by I don't know, importers, supermarket chains or whatever. This is not covered by the EU food legislation.
Correcto, y aquí lo menciona Keylor Chávez. De hecho, en el chat, él dice el tema de la cantidad de LMRs restringidos obedecen a algunos clientes que tienen ese requisito, pero no es un tema de legalidad. Entonces, creo que esto coincide con lo que Germán nos está explicando, que no es un tema propiamente de la regulación europea, sino más bien de la negociación entre actores privados en el mercado europeo. Bueno, muy bien. Ya hemos cubierto los primeros 40 minutos. Sé que todavía quedan algunas preguntas, pero si les parece, avancemos con la siguiente presentación, que de hecho es de Germán. Es una presentación de 20 minutos sobre Setting of Import Tolerance in the EU. Y luego podemos tomar nuevamente preguntas y respuestas. Y voy a dar seguimiento a lo que tenemos en el chat para estar seguras que estamos abarcando las preguntas que se están haciendo. Entonces, Germán, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you very much. And I hope you can see the screen now. Just to present myself, I'm Senior Scientific Officer working in EFSA since 2006. Before I was working in the Austrian authorities, also dealing with pesticides. So a few days ago, I had my 30 years professional anniversary working in the pesticide field. So I'm really a persistent pesticide person, I would say. Now, in the next 20 minutes, I would like to talk to you about import tolerance setting and some frequently asked questions with regard to import tolerances. But let's just go into the topic. Basic principle in Europe is imported food must also comply with our EU food standards. It's the same as for products that are produced in Europe. So the the MRLs are established, as mentioned by Luis, under Regulation 396 of 2005. Our MRLs are not intended to create trade barriers. For that reason, we have this possibility to request import tolerances. These are MRLs that are established for imported products to meet the need of the international trade. Like other MRLs, they apply without any discrimination to the country, to the product, to this pesticide crop combination. So once an MRL has been established and you find a value in the Regulation 396, it doesn't matter whether it was requested by Costa Rica or it was established because of a use in Italy. So this is a basic principle. So when is there a need to request an import tolerance? Yeah, basically, if the existing EU MRL does not cover the uses of third countries. This is very often the case because products are not grown in Europe. Certain food products are not frequently grown in Europe, or because a pesticide is not approved in Europe, or this combination of the pesticide crop is not authorized in Europe, or we have an authorization, but maybe for a different GAP, which leads to lower residues. So it's not the critical GAP that we have authorized in Europe. One basic principle is also, it was already mentioned before, but I think it's important to repeat that we have this principle of setting default MRLs. So whenever there is no specific MRL established in the legislation, the default MRL of 0.01 would apply. There is a bit of an exemption. There is a couple of substances for which there is no need to establish MRLs. So substances like microorganisms and some basic substances are exempted from the need of the setting of MRLs. But for all other cases, you will have either a specific MRL in the legislation or the default MRL of 0.01 would apply. Now, where do I find now the existing MRLs that are applicable in Europe? Usually, well, the legal source is the official journal of the European Commission, of the European Union. But to facilitate the search, the Commission has established a very useful database, which I have included here the links. So the database allows, maybe we can open this link. The database allows to search for active substances, but also you have the possibility to search for food products or for pesticide residues. There is a bit something I wanted to highlight to you is want to illustrate with an example. So if you have a question like, what is the existing EU MRL for hexadiazox in sapodillas? Well, I would recommend maybe to consult first this page on the products. Sapodilla is a product that is not very frequently consumed in Europe, and you would not find it in the food classification as such. However, if you search for the product, you will find it is listed under cherimoyas. Here, sapodillas, you find sapodillas, and that means that the MRLs established for cherimoyas would also apply to sapodillas. For the major food products like pineapples, bananas, there it's clear, but this is just a hint how to find also less frequently products that are of that are a bit hidden in our food classification. So for Sapodillas, we know now the MRLs apply that are established for Cherimoya. Now, if we want to know the pesticide, the actual MRL, I would recommend to go to the pesticide tab and search for the active substance, hexitiazox, hexitiazox. You tick it here, and then you can display the list of MRLs, and then you can either scroll down, or you can also there's an option to download the table in an Excel file. What I wanted to show you here is, well, you see, we have hexitiazox, the MRLs applicable, and something is in the pipeline to change. And now I'm sorry, I'm a bit struggling with my screen to get to the right spot. Allora, if you download now this file, you will see that for hexitiazox, we had an existing MRL of 0.5, but it will now be lowered with this with a new regulation that has been recently voted, that is not yet applicable. It will be lowered. So this new legislation will become applicable in, I think, in beginning of 2022. That a new MRL, a lower MRL, will be applicable. This is just to show you where to find information about possible changes, because I think this is really important. And also from the questions before, we have seen that MRLs are changing. The reasons why MRLs are changing in the EU are manifold. We have a reason can be that an active substance has been approved in the past, but is no longer approved because there was no interest of the company, because the dossier submitted in the process of the periodic review at EU level was not sufficient. There were some risks identified that led to a non-approval decision. If there's a non-approval, or if the approval expires, in the next step, also the existing EU MRLs may be lowered. So EU MRLs may be lowered unless we know these are import tolerances or these are Codex MRLs. Therefore, you should not rely on well, we have an MRL established and this will stay forever. You have to be vigilant and monitor what is going on with active substances at EU level. I provided you here also some links where you can find, some information here. For example, a link to identify which decisions are taken at EU level on non-approval. So if something is under preparation, that products will not continue to be approved at EU level. This you could find when you follow the minutes of the PAF committee meeting, where these decisions are discussed and then finally agreed. There's another reason for changing of existing MRLs is the kind of a periodic review that we perform for the existing MRLs. So also in the EU, similar to the Codex, an MRL will not stay forever, but in the light of new information that becomes available with time, we will also review the existing MRLs and check whether they are still sufficiently supported and whether they are still safe for consumers. In any case, before a decision on lowering of existing EU MRLs is taken, the European Commission would notify this information via the SBS notification to inform trading partners on the planned measures. But this is at the very late stage in the process. So this is close to the publication of a new MRL regulation. And I think it would be good to also have a bit view on what to monitor what is ongoing at an earlier stage, to be prepared and to have enough time to prepare an import tolerance application. Now, who can apply for an import tolerance? Well, this is also defined in the regulation. Basically, all parties who have a legitimate interest in health, but also commercially interested parties like manufacturers, growers, importers, or food business operators. The majority of the applications will come, we know, comes via manufacturers, but also growers or associations once in a while submit applications. So this is in many cases, applications are also submitted via consultants, because I think you have to be aware, process is not that simple, and in order to make a successful application, it might be good advice to seek professional support also in making an application. Now, to whom, to which member state should the import tolerance application be submitted? Well, normally import tolerances should be submitted to the rapporteur member state, so the member state that knows the active substance best, but there are also options that you can choose another member state, but you need to have the agreement of the rapporteur member state. The rapporteur member states designated for the individual active substances can be found also in the Commission database. I put here the link also to this page where you would find them. If there is no rapporteur member state designated in the EU because it's an active substance that has never been assessed in Europe, then you should contact the European Commission that will then decide together with the member states who will take care of this application. Now, how to submit an MRL application? Well, there we have a big change now introduced in this year, since March 2021, since the new transparency regulation has been entered into force. Applications are submitted via a system that is called Euclid format. Euclid is a format that originally has been developed by our sister agency, the European Chemicals Agency, and it has been now adapted also to address the needs for pesticides. There is a lot of information, a lot of training material available, manuals, how to complete the Euclid, how to submit the dossiers in Euclid. I included here some links. There are also some videos available that can be consulted. I think it goes definitely beyond the scope of this exercise here to talk about Euclid, but I hope you can find reasonable information. In case that's not enough, at the end of the slides, you will find some contact points to whom you could address your questions. Now, which data need to be provided with an import tolerance application? Well, first you need to demonstrate that the use is authorized in the exporting country, so an authorization certificate or an approved label. You should also provide the information on the MRL and the residue definition established in the exporting country, and then you need to submit the dossier. Depending on whether the active substance is already approved in the EU or not, the volume of the dossier may differ. So let's have a look at the dossier for active substances that have never been assessed at EU level. I think the basic headlines have been already addressed by Luis before. So when we talk about import tolerances, we want to see an analytical method that can be used by enforcement laboratories to monitor the residues in the food imported to Europe. Toxicological standards studies are required to derive toxicological reference values, so the ADI and the acute reference dose, and the data package on the residue behavior, metabolism studies, residue trials, studies on the nature and magnitude of residues in processed products, and if the product or some byproducts are used for feed purpose, also livestock metabolism and livestock feeding studies. An applicant should also provide then the proposed residue definition and the proposed MRL, and he has to demonstrate that these proposed MRLs are safe by providing a dietary risk assessment using the PRIMo calculator. Luis will present this in his next presentation, how the exposure calculations are performed. There is also something new in the pipeline. You may have heard about the Green Deal. It's a very ambitious project at EU level. Under this Green Deal, there are some discussions that beyond the consumer safety aspects in future, for import tolerances, an applicant may be also requested to address some environmental aspects which are of global concerns, in particular for pollinators and for soil, so for persistent soil pollutants. The details on this are still under preparation. I cannot tell you much more at that stage, but I would also recommend to keep an eye on communications from the European Union, what is developed in this field now. Now, when we talk about active substances, so import tolerances for active substances that have already been assessed at EU level, there are some data waivers. That means you don't have to provide the full data package, but you can take advantage of studies that have been already assessed at EU level. So for example, if there's already an analytical method available for the crop group for which you request an import tolerance, then you don't have to provide this method. The same for toxicological data. If we have already established toxicological reference data values for the active substance and the metabolites, there would not be more data required. The same for other aspects that we discussed before. You can rely on data that were submitted previously. Just one word about the PRIMo. Here it might be a bit more complicated to request an import tolerance application for an active substance where you have already a lot of uses approved in Europe and which are already contributing to the dietary exposure of European consumers. Here you should have in mind that you can request a new use as long as the risk cap is not full yet. So if there is something that is leading to a significant exposure and it would lead to an exceedance of the ADI, then it is not very likely that an import tolerance application will be a success. Now, which conditions need to be fulfilled that an import tolerance is acceptable? Well, we need to have, of course, a complete dossier. The MRL proposal that is derived with the OECD calculator shall not be higher than the MRL in the country of origin. We don't want to be more generous, so to say, with import tolerances than you would be in your own country. There are some exemptions. So if, for example, there are small differences in the residue definitions, this difference may be justified. But in general, we would not set the MRL higher than the MRL in the country of origin. And as mentioned before, the proposed MRL may not pose a risk to European consumers. And here I bring in this concept of the risk cap. As long as you are not at 100%, we still have room to grant new MRLs. When we are at 100%, new MRLs cannot be established anymore. In the chronic risk assessment, and of course for the acute risk assessment, we would have an individual look at the individual commodities. So individually, the contribution of the residues in the commodity should not exceed 100% of the acute reference dose. Now, how long does it take to establish an import tolerance? Well, it's a lengthy process. I just tried here to put some steps in the process together. But as a general rule, the experience shows that from the submission of a complete dossier to the entry into force of an import tolerance, you have to calculate at least 2 years. There may be, well, here the EFSA is involved in some of the steps. We have 3 months to do our evaluations and to prepare our assessment report, our reasoned opinion. Usually we have 3 months. For more extended applications, it's 6 months. If the data set that was submitted with the dossier is not complete, then this time can be prolonged by the time it's required to complete the dossier. And I think that's all from my side now. If you're I'm happy to take any questions now, or if you have some other questions that come later, please do not hesitate to send me a message and I will be happy to reply. Thank you.
Gracias, Germán. Muy amable de tu parte indicar incluso el correo electrónico. En realidad sí tenemos bastantes preguntas. De hecho, creo que voy a tomar únicamente un par. No creo que podamos abarcar todas las preguntas hoy y no quiero retrasar el tiempo de las presentaciones. Luego podríamos pensar en aclarar algunas de las dudas por escrito. Pero quería hacer una pregunta general que se había hecho anteriormente, que tiene que ver con la relación entre la decisión de no renovar la autorización de una sustancia y la modificación del límite máximo de residuos. Siempre que se desautoriza el uso de una sustancia, esto implica necesariamente que se elimina la tolerancia de importación.
Well, normally, if we know that it's an import tolerance and we have sufficient support for this import tolerance, the MRL would not be automatically deleted. That's the standard process. However, there may be some reasons, consumer health concerns, why the active substance was not renewed. Then, of course, in the light of this additional information that we received in the renewal process, we may need to review also the MRL, whether it's still safe. So it's a bit ambiguous. I know it's not a yes or no, but that's how it is. So if the existing import tolerance is safe and the non-renewal was taken because of, I don't know, some environmental concerns in the EU, the import tolerance may be still continued. However, if the non-approval was taken because of consumer health concerns, we have to have a close look whether the import tolerances are still justified, whether we can say that the import tolerance is safe. If this is not the case, then probably the import tolerance will be also modified or lowered to the LOQ.
Muy bien, gracias. Esa es una de las preguntas que se repiten. Otra pregunta, mientras contestamos otra pregunta, invitaría a Luis para que vaya compartiendo su presentación, la próxima. Mientras Luis se prepara, quisiera preguntar, Germán, si existe una relación entre
yes, I tried to find, here we are, yes, okay. Don't know whether I can.
I was mentioning that maybe yes. In the meantime that we take another question. Maybe yes. We can leave Luis to.
Yes, here now I find it. Sorry.
Yes. No, it's okay. Tenemos otra pregunta que tiene que ver sobre la relación entre el límite máximo de residuos y el nivel de ingesta diaria permitida. Si existe, al determinar un límite máximo de residuos, se toma en cuenta el nivel de ingesta diaria admisible. Quería saber si tenías un comentario sobre este tema.
I think Luis will come to this topic now in his presentation when we talk about the dietary risk assessment. So how is the relationship between the MRL, the residues in food, and the consumer exposure, the amount of food consumed, and the ADI or the acute reference dose established for this active substance. I don't want to anticipate what Luis is now presenting. I hope after this presentation it will be clearer.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you so much, Hermine. We are going to give the floor to Luis. Without any further consideration, please, Luis, go ahead with your presentation. Thank you.
Hola, buenos días otra vez. So I will give you the third presentation of today, which is on the risk assessment for pesticide residues and also an example of the EFSA PRIMo. So then, in this presentation, I will talk about the exposure assessment, both the chronic and acute. Then the risk assessment, so if the pesticide as consumed by the European consumers poses a risk to the health. And then, as I said, one practical example using EFSA PRIMo, although it has to be acknowledged that the purpose of this presentation is not to enter into detail in the using of EFSA PRIMo. This is just to let you know that we use this tool in Europe to assess whether the MRL at the end is safe for consumers. So going back to my previous picture where I described the different steps in the MRL assessment, now in this presentation, I will cover the next step. So after we have set the MRLs for plants and for animals, if they are applicable, then we need to assess whether they are safe for consumers. Then going back again to the principle of risk assessment. Risk assessment, as I said in my previous presentation, is a scientifically based process to assess the risk resulting from the expected exposure of a chemical. In this case, the chemical is the pesticide. Then in the risk assessment, there are 4 steps, let's say. The first 2 are the hazard identification and characterization. Then we have the exposure assessment. And finally, we will have the risk characterization. Then for the hazard identification and characterization, we need to ask ourselves the following question. How toxic are the substances present on or in the food resulting from the use of the pesticides? Then for the exposure assessment, the question is how much pesticide residues do we consume with the food? And finally, for the characterization is the expected pesticide intake pose a risk to consumers? Then for the first 2 steps, so the hazard identification characterization, how toxic is the substance that are expected in food treated with pesticides? So after the previous steps, let's say, with the intended uses, we have defined the nature of the residue, we have calculated the MRL levels. In parallel, we have in the dossier of the active substance, animal tests. Now they are trying to be more in vitro or in silico in order to preserve animal welfare. There are tests to derive the so-called no adverse effect level in animals. And then with a series of safety factors, the toxicological reference values for humans are established. The ADI is the acceptable daily intake in the units of milligram per kilogram body weight per day. And the RFD is the acute reference dose in the units of milligram kilogram body weight. So these toxicological reference values are established by the tox part of, let's say, of the assessment in the dossier. And then we use the ADI for the long-term exposure and the RFD, the acute, for the short-term. The toxicological reference values are concentrations that are unlikely to produce undesirable effects in humans. But if they are exceeded, then the undesirable effects cannot be disregarded or excluded. And that's why we put as a threshold the ADI or the RFD. So then now we have our our hazard identification and characterization performed. So we go to the exposure assessment. On one side, we will have the expected concentration of the pesticide in or on the food. This is basically coming from the supervised residue trials that were performed in order to set the MRL level. And on the other side, in Europe, we have the food consumption data coming from the EU surveys performed at member state level in Europe, and the data of the consumption on the EU surveys on the food consumption habits of the Europeans. We can estimate the exposure assessment by combining those two. Then we will see with a little bit more detail in the next slide. So how much pesticide residues do we consume with food? As I said, on one side, we will have the residual concentration of the pesticide, of the active substance, sorry, in the different crops, in the different commodities. This is coming from the residue trials. And on the other side, we have the food consumption data of European consumers. Then, with a model algorithm, we combine both, and then we do the exposure assessment. This model algorithm, in the case of Europe, is the PRIMo, is the EFSA PRIMo. But this is something quite important to say, that the calculations of the PRIMo are done according to internationally agreed methodologies. Of course, the EU surveys are mostly referring to the EU population, even though some WHO clusters are included in the EFSA PRIMo. With this is to say that when the exposure assessment is done in a third country, we do not oblige to use the EFSA PRIMo. However, if it is for an MRL, which is going to be through an import tolerance application, and at the end to be put the crop, the commodity, the product on the European market, we will evaluate the exposure assessment using the EFSA PRIMo. So then the EFSA PRIMo stands for the pesticide residue intake model, is an Excel-based calculation tool which was developed to calculate the dietary exposure to pesticide residues in food, as I said, according to internationally agreed methodologies defined by the GMPR, resulting from the use of pesticides, and to assess whether the exposure is posing a risk to the health of the European consumers, because the consumption data that we have in PRIMo are mostly for the European consumers. Here are three important links for you. The calculation spreadsheet as such, so in order to use the PRIMo, then you have the guidance document and also a technical report for the last version of the PRIMo, which is the 3.1. As I said, the scope of this presentation is not to give training on the use of PRIMo. This is just for you to know where to find the information. So now that we have the exposure assessment, we need to do the risk assessment. And how do we do that? We compare the exposure expected using the PRIMo with the toxicological reference values, which are again the ADI and the RFD. And then we do the chronic risk assessment, comparing with the ADI, and the acute risk assessment, comparing with the acute reference dose, according to international agreed methodologies, which are implemented in the EFSA PRIMo, and for the relevant European consumer subgroups for which we have consumption data in the EFSA PRIMo. Then for the chronic, we do, there are several assumptions to be done. This is again also according to agreed methodologies. The first one is that all the food for which the pesticide is or will be authorized is treated with the pesticide. So if we are eating apples, all apples will be treated with the pesticide. And it is like that because PRIMo is a conservative model. Then we also assume that it contains the median concentration observed or measured in the supervised residue trials. The median, okay, not the highest. Then we assume that we have an average consumption of the food items, and we do the calculation for a lifetime exposure. And then, according to the agreed international methodology developed by the GMPR, the exposure will be the result of summing the product of median residue per average food intake for each commodity. And then the sum is the exposure according to the chronic assessment. For the acute, we don't do like the overall exposure to all the different commodities. We do for each individual commodity. Why? Because it is quite unlikely that we as consumers will be an strict consumer for more than one commodity, and we will find extreme residues of one pesticide in more than one commodity. What means that, for example, if I consume a lot of apples in one single meal, it is quite unlikely that if I also, well, first that I will consume a lot of oranges, a large consumption of oranges in that single meal. But not only that, that not only my apples that I'm eating are treated with the pesticide and contains the highest residue of the pesticide, also the oranges will be like that. So since this is quite unlikely, the calculations are performed for each individual commodity. The assumptions are that it is a large portion consumption, as I said. The time frame is quite short. It is within a single meal or within 1 day. We assume that we are consuming food containing the pesticide at the highest residue found in the residue triangles. And we will also take into consideration a possible inhomogeneous distribution of the residues within the lot. Let's say if we are eating apples, so from the lot from which the apples were taken. And the calculations are done with the IST equation, which is the International Estimated Short-Term Intake. There are 3 different cases for the IST equation. I put the information here for you to have it. I'm not going to enter into detail because, again, this is not the scope of this presentation. But basically, the cases are a function of the unit weight of the product. So, for example, for small fruits like strawberries, with a unit weight less than below 25 grams, then the IST equation will take that form. Important that we are talking about the highest residue here. So the HR of the processed, the unprocessed commodity or the processed commodity. Then in another case, in the case 2A, the product is a little bit bigger, so the unit weight is higher than 25 grams. And then this is the form of the IST equation with a variability factor here. And there is a case 2B, which is for big products, like, for example, a pineapple, a melon. Usually in one single meal, we don't eat the whole melon or the whole pineapple, just a portion of it. And then in that case, the IST equation takes a different form, also with a variability factor here. Here are the variability factors used at EU level. Again, this is for your information. I'm not going to enter into detail. And then there is a case 3, which is quite interesting to be described because it is for bulk blended products, like, for example, rice, milk, juice, wine, etc. Because here the IST is not with the HR, the highest residue, it is with the STMR. Again, why? Because it is more appropriate to use the STMR, because if we eat a portion of rice in one single meal, it is composed by quite a lot of rice grains, and it is quite unlikely that all the rice grains will contain the highest residue found in the residue trial. So that's why instead of taking the highest, we take the median, sorry, not the mean. Then I don't know if you are confused because we have different cases for the IST equation, but all that is already included in the EFSA PRIMo spreadsheet, and in principle, there is you don't need to be so worried. As I said, at the end of the ultimate, let's say, question of all this is if the intended use or uses we are evaluating are safe for consumers. So if you are submitting an import tolerance application to the EU, Again, at national level in the third country, we do not enter or we do not oblige to use the EFSA PRIMo in order to do the exposure assessment. But if the import tolerance application is going to be submitted to Europe, we highly advise to you to include an evaluation. I mean, to use the EFSA PRIMo in your dossier and to have a look to the results. Because at the end, as I said, we will evaluate whether the MRL proposed is safe for the European consumers. Then some hints for you: if you visit the Open EFSA, you need to register. Here, of course, I'm already registered because I'm EFSA staff, but in any case, so if you go to questions and you click on the name of the active substance you are interested, you can also type in the question number. To find the question number, you need to go to the EFSA output, and you click, and then you go to the output of your interest. In my case, it's the confirmatory data following the article 12 review. You go to the evidence inventory, and here you can find the EFSA PRIMo done in this output by EFSA. Then you click and then you will download. I have already downloaded, and it is this one. So bifenthrin is a substance which is approved in the EU. This is the most recent PRIMo performed. Here is the tox reference value, the ADI and the RFD. You have the residue definitions for enforcement and risk assessment for plants, unprocessed and processed, and for animals. In this case, it's the same. The residue definition is the same for all of them. And here is where you have all your input values. So the input values, the STMR will come here, the HR will come here. And if, for example, imagine you are submitting a new import tolerance for bananas. So then in your gap under assessment, you have to say yes, because bananas is your commodity under assessment. Well, first, let's do it like this. We will have a look to the results of this assessment. And we see that we are at 42% of the ADI and 61% of the RFD. So as Hermine said before, there is room to have, let's say, an increased another MRL on another commodity, or even to increase the MRL slightly and not to have risk for consumers. So in your case, you will come here. I said bananas. These are complete imaginative example. And then in your STMR coming from the residue trials for the import tolerance, now instead of having 0.010, you will have 0.015. Here you have, for example, 0.020. And then if you go to your results, nothing even changed. I hope I am, sorry, in automatic mode. Yes. So you see that even if there is a little increase, we can say that it is quite unlikely that this assessment poses a risk to the European consumers. To finalize, I will go back to my presentation. So on the EFSA, on the Open EFSA, you can find the different PRIMos linked to each EFSA output on pesticides. And also in the output itself, you can find the results, not the spreadsheet sheet as such, but you can find the results like this. And with that, I have finished my presentation.
Muchas gracias, Luis. Muy buenas las presentaciones. Estábamos comentando justamente que estamos súper contentos con la actividad, las presentaciones con información muy relevante, muy bien explicado, muy claro. Tengo un poquito de preocupación porque tenemos cantidad de preguntas y poco tiempo. De hecho, varias de las preguntas o de los comentarios han tenido que ver con si la Unión Europea toma en cuenta los límites establecidos a nivel del Codex. Y la próxima presentación, que está planeada para justamente a las 9:40 en este preciso momento, son 10 minutos en donde Germán nos habla solo sobre la relevancia de los límites máximos de residuos del Codex en la Unión Europea. Entonces, creo que mejor damos la palabra a Germán para que ella haga referencia a esta presentación, y posteriormente dejamos 10 minutos para tomar la mayor cantidad de preguntas que podamos. ¿De acuerdo?
Me parece correcto.
Entonces,
Gracias.
Germán, te doy la palabra con la próxima presentación sobre el Codex.
Thank you very much. And so that means I will start now with my second presentation. If I manage with all my, you know, let's.
Don't worry, don't worry.
Okay.
There it is.
It's visible, okay? Then the
It is visible.
presentation mode, okay.
Exactly.
Yes. No, it's a bit. Now you see it. Okay, this presentation now is dealing with Codex MRLs, which is a kind of import tolerance for the EU. And after this presentation, you should have a bit an understanding what we are doing at EU level in the context of Codex, and also whether it would make sense to rely on Codex MRLs, or whether it's more appropriate to request specific import tolerances in the EU. So which strategy would be better, in which case to get access to the European market via the appropriate MRLs established. So let's have a look at the slides. Here I just copied as a general procedure, the general procedure of how Codex standards are established. I don't know whether you have experiences in Codex work, but it's quite complex, and they follow for establishing a Codex standard, a step procedure needs to be followed. And in the next slide that is displayed in this screen here, in the next slide, I tried to translate this step procedure in the Codex MRL procedure, which also follows the steps. So the procedure starts with the nomination of an active substance or new uses for Codex MRL setting. So a nomination is made normally by a Codex member, a country, and then in the step 1, it's discussed in a working group, in a electronic working group. They agree on the schedule for GMPR assessment. GMPR is doing the scientific assessment of this data and make the proposals of Codex MRL. So GMPR is a bit what EFSA is doing at European level is done by GMPR in the Codex context. Once GMPR has finalized an assessment, they publish their scientific assessment in GMPR reports, and at step 3, they are submitted for commenting to Codex members. This is the first round of commenting. The discussion then takes place in the CCPR plenary, and the discussion are captured in the CCPR report. The outcome of this discussion can be that, well, if there are no controversial topics, the Codex MRL can advance this fast-track procedure from step 5 to step 8. That means at step 8, it's then adopted by Codex Alimentarius Commission, and Codex MRL proposal becomes a Codex MRL, so something that is a value that is helping at the international trade, facilitating the international trade. There's also the option of having the steps from 5 to 6, 7, but for the MRL, Codex MRLs, most of the cases are following the step 5, 8 process. Now, where is the EU involved, and what kind of engagement can you expect from the EU? Well, we are engage ourselves in the establishment of the work program. There is the feeling that there needs to be the EU considers that it's very important to find a balance between setting new MRLs for new compounds and to do also a periodic review of existing Codex MRLs. So it's not only adding new substances to the Codex list, but also to have a look what on the MRLs that have been established 15, 20 years ago, whether they still comply with the most recent scientific standards. At that step, you may also receive sometimes concern forms from the EU. And this is done when we identify really health concerns in the context of our European review programs, either in the renewal process, but also in the context of MRL reviews. This is something that we would communicate also to Codex to say, look, we have new information that would require a re-evaluation of the existing Codex MRLs. So this is the engagement of the EU at step 1. We also are very active at step 3. So in the first round of commenting of Codex MRL proposals derived by GMPR, we have a process in place where EFSA is requested by the European Commission to support in preparing the EU comments, which is then presented as the EU position in the CCPR meeting. So we do an assessment at EFSA level. We also liaise with the member states, and we then finally present these findings and we discuss it in council working parties. We come to that in a few slides. The assessment done by EFSA, what we are doing at that stage is we compile regulatory background information on the active substances assessed by GMPR in the respective year. So what has been assessed at EU levels, what were the findings in EU reviews that might be of relevance for deriving a position for the Codex MRL proposals. We would also have a look at the toxicological reference values that were proposed by GMPR, compare it with the EU toxicological reference values, see whether they have more information, whether we have additional information. If we come to different conclusions, what is the reason for the difference that could explain the different ADIs that are established by the different scientific bodies. Most of the work is focusing on the MRL proposals as such, where we will have a look at the residue definitions. Are the residue definitions comparable, derived by GMPR and at EU level? We would compare the MRLs. Would the Codex MRLs require a modification of the existing EU MRLs, or do we anyway have already higher MRLs in place? We would have a look at the data package behind the Codex MRLs, whether these MRL proposals are sufficiently supported by data. And in that context, we would not apply our European data requirements, but we would check it against the data requirements or that are defined at Codex level. So just to keep this apart, we would not apply our rules on the minimum number of residue trials, but we would have a look what is required in Codex to establish an MRL for that crop. And then we would, of course, also perform a consumer risk assessment using PRIMo to see whether if we would add these new Codex MRLs now in the European legislation, and if we would expose European consumers to these residues, whether this would pose a risk or not. And this is also then reported in our assessment and shared with the member states. Then the final EU position is derived, as I mentioned before, in the framework of Council working parties, which the Council meetings are chaired by the EU presidency. So it's not the European Commission, but the member state that has the presidency in that semester of the meeting. Participation of member states experts is foreseen, of course, also the European Commission and EFSA representative to give advice on our findings that we presented as a basis for the EU common position. But the decision is taken by risk managers in the Council. It's not that that EFSA is defining the position. So that's just to make that clear. Now we move on to step 4. This is now really the discussion in the CCPR meeting, where our EU position is presented. There are basically 4 types of comments or interventions that we make. So the first one I mentioned here are EU comments on GMPR assessments, where we identify something is missing. An MRL should be labeled with an asterisk as being an MRL at the LOQ, or there was a calculation problem. But basically, we would not oppose to that proposal. The second point, again, we would support the advancement of the Codex MRL proposal in the step procedure. That means the proposal can move ahead, be presented to Codex Alimentarius Commission and be adopted. Once this is completed, once the step procedure at Codex level is completed, these MRLs for which the EU supports the advancement, they are all integrated in the EU legislation. So usually the Commission prepares one regulation where all these MRLs are then introduced in our legislation. What we have to do is just to find the matching commodity codes in our food classification, and then they would enter into force without any further need for any application. There are 2 other cases of interventions of the EU in the Codex meeting. One is the opposition to the advancement of a Codex MRL proposal. This is usually done when GMPR also identify the consumer health concern. So it's a MRL proposal that would be not safe for consumers. For this, we also would say, stop, we cannot go ahead. This is not a safe MRL. The last point is probably the most interesting for you. It's on cases where the EU introduces a reservation in the CCPR meeting. Reservation means that the CXL will not be implemented in the EU legislation, or maybe it will be implemented, but the implementation is a bit delayed. But we would not block the Codex step procedure. So the Codex MRL still advances and can be used by other Codex members as a trade standard. But for different reasons that we will see later, these Codex MRLs would not be considered acceptable in the EU. Now, the reasons why we make reservations. The first reason is something a bit procedural. In some of the cases, the EU assessment of this active substance is just ongoing, and we would like to await first the outcome of the EU assessment, and then at the second step, once this outcome was positive, we would then implement the Codex MRLs in the EU legislation. But the intention here is to avoid that we set MRLs, we go up, and then a few months later we have to lower it, and maybe then we come back with another MRL. This is creating trade disruption and should be avoided. Therefore, it's considered a better solution just to wait the outcome of the EU assessment and then decide whether the Codex MRL is acceptable and can be integrated in the EU legislation. Other reasons why we do not take over Codex MRLs and why we make reservations are linked to incompatibilities of the residue definitions. So maybe the European residue definition is broader. We have also included metabolites in our enforcement residue definition, which is not covered by the Codex MRL. In that case, we cannot take over the Codex MRL because in the end it would underestimate. Well, we expect that an MRL, that there are MRL exceedances because the residues in the treated products may be higher, because also the metabolite may contribute to the total residue. In this case, it might be possible to request import tolerances, providing us the information on the occurrence of this additional metabolite. And then I think it would be possible to establish an MRL compliant with the EU residue definition. Similarly, there may be problems with the residue definition for risk assessment that, for example, GMPR did not include certain metabolites which we consider toxicologically relevant. And if we cannot estimate the exposure, then we cannot not say this MRL is safe for European consumers. So these are topics related to residue definitions, but there are also other problems that we sometimes encounter. Sometimes we identify that the Codex MRL is higher than necessary. And here I would like to recall you what Luis mentioned before. Our MRLs should be as low as possible. Should be established at the lowest level that is possible in line with the good agricultural practice. We have noted that Codex uses different crop groupings, leading to broader MRLs for commodities where we think it's not necessary to set these MRLs. They may use also different extrapolation rules. These are more policy questions. Also, in this case, it might be possible to come with import tolerances to request then the MRL for specific commodities, not for the whole group, but for specific commodities that are relevant. A specific case I wanted to mention here also is rice. This is an example where the crop descriptions to which the MRL applies do not match. The EU crop description for rice is, well, the husked rice, while Codex establishes an MRL for the rice with the husk. They sometimes also establish separate MRLs for the husked rice. This we could take over, but we could not take over the Codex MRL for the rice for the code GC 0649, for example. There are some other reasons why we cannot take over Codex MRLs in the EU legislation. If we identify serious data gaps in the dossier supporting the Codex MRL, we would also not agree to establish these MRLs in the EU. Examples are lack of information on the general toxicity of the active substance or relevant metabolites, what we consider as a relevant metabolite. Maybe GMPR does not consider this is an important metabolite, and therefore no tox data are available. This would be a reason. Other problem that we frequently identify is an insufficient evidence to demonstrate the absence of genotoxicity of an active substance or a metabolite. In our view, it's really the burden of proof lies with an applicant to clearly demonstrate that an active substance and the metabolite do not have genotoxic properties. We have very rigorous requirements here. We apply the same standards at European level, and we would require the same standards also at international level. There may be also some other data gaps related to plant metabolism or formation of degradation products under processing. When I had a look at some recent cases where we had reservations, we also had sometimes problems with the number of residue trials that were submitted that were not compliant with the number of trials that are defined in the GMPR manual. So, as I said before, we would not apply the EU rules, but the GMPR requirements. And then, of course, we have the problem with the risk assessment. In some cases, the EU risk assessment is already, we are close to or at 100%. We cannot add new uses unless we would sacrifice other European uses. But this is another discussion that we cannot do in the context of before a Codex MRL is established. The reason why we identify different a possible consumer health risk, well, it could be linked to the fact that we have specific consumption data that are not reflected in the risk assessment done by GMPR. And the last reason, I think this is also something that we had long discussions at Codex level. We have in principle our risk assessment methodology is the internationally agreed risk assessment methodology. We have some slight differences in the methodology, in the acute risk assessment methodology, in the ISDKs 2A and 2B related to the variability factor. But overall, I think this is not really the main reason why we make reservations. There's maybe once in a while a reason, and then we could do even probably other refinements. But this is not the major source of the reservations we raise in Codex. Once we have agreed, as I said before, now we are moving to step 8. Codex Alimentarius Commission has adopted the Codex standard. Once it's established, then all these acceptable Codex MRLs will be then implemented in our legislation, and you will not be able to distinguish it anymore, whether it's an import tolerance, whether it's a Codex MRL, or whether a certain MRL is an MRL resulting from a use of the pesticide. Now, conclusion of this presentation, I just wanted to give you an idea of the decisions on implementation of Codex MRLs in the EU legislation. We apply a very detailed assessment before we decide on it. And the basic principle is that Codex MRLs, the same as EU MRLs, must be safe for consumers. They should not be a trade barrier, so we are open, but consumer protection is something that needs to be demonstrated, that without that we cannot accept to raise the existing MRLs at EU level. Our EU MRLs also should fulfill some other principles. Of course, the MRLs are established on the basis of a good agricultural practice. A farmer that is respecting this good agricultural practice should have the certainty that his food products are compliant with the EU legislation. This is applicable for European farmers as well as for farmers in third countries. We have talked about the minimization principle, so this ALARA principle. We would like to set the MRLs as low as possible. If there's no use of a pesticide, we set the MRLs at the LOQ. And we also have the precautionary principle. So also in case of data are missing, by default, we would say, well, the burden of proof is always with an applicant. They need to demonstrate us the safe use of a product. It's not us to demonstrate that something is not safe. And as long as we cannot demonstrate proof that something is not safe, it's acceptable. So these are just the general principles that I wanted to wrap up here at the end of my presentation. And with this, I would like to close now, and I'm happy to take questions either now, or if we have no time now to answer them now, we can also, you can send us the question, maybe the compilation of the questions from this conference now, and we will come back to you and share our answers with you in writing. But if we have a couple of minutes, we can also have some discussion here now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Herman, for your presentation. I think the issue of Codex and the participation of the EU within the Codex context is of very much of an interest for Central America. I have seen several of the comments that are stating the importance of harmonization at the international level, and how important it is for the Central American countries to be able to rely upon the Codex MR. And so your presentation was very broad on this issue. You explained transparently what are the issues that you take into consideration, why, and when do you decide to separate yourself from the decisions that Codex and to go beyond and establish more restrict, I guess, residue limits. I have some questions here. We don't have much time. We are already above the time, above the hour, but I think that maybe we can stay for, let's say, 10 more minutes to take some questions, and then we can wrap up the event. And please, Joaquin, also feel free to intervene whenever you feel like. I have a question from Massimo. He asked concerning supervised trials to establish the MRLs, who bears the cost and who conducts them?
If you allow, I can reply to that. As I said, the burden of proof of the safety of an MRL lies with an applicant. So normally an applicant has to provide these trials, and they have to bear the cost for that. Normally these trials are done by the manufacturers. They in the end make business with selling the product for this the use, and they are the first to be approached in case an MRL should be established or is needed for a country, to see whether they are willing to support that by providing the studies necessary to request this MRL. In Europe, we have some examples also that residue trials are organized by growers associations. So this is in particular for very minor products, for niche products, where there's no interest of big companies, and then they find some money to generate these trials. But what is important is also, if you perform residue trials, you need to comply with the guidelines. So it's not just to, you need to have a professional design of the trial, professional analysis, otherwise it's waste of money. So therefore, the first address would be the applicant, would be a manufacturer who has the knowledge how to do that.
Okay, thank you very much, Germán, for addressing that question. Tengo un comentario de Esteban Blanco. Él dice, espectacular el manejo de datos, la tecnología y la transparencia de la agencia EFSA. Entonces, bueno, quería destacar ese comentario también como un agradecimiento por la información que ustedes nos están compartiendo el día de hoy. Luego preguntan sobre metales pesados, si es la misma evaluación de riesgo en el caso de los metales pesados.
Yes, well, heavy metals do not really fall under the pesticide legislation in the EU. So I'm afraid I'm not a competent person to give you advice on that. So if you're interested, we can provide you contacts in EFSA who could help you on such questions. If you're interested in, if you just let us know in writing, then I will bring you in contact with our colleagues dealing with that.
Thank you so much, Germán. Exactly, it is a different set of regulations that will apply to heavy metals. Luego tengo acá una pregunta de Orlando Delgado. Dice, durante el proceso de recopilación de información para realizar la evaluación toxicológica de los efectos agudos y crónicos de plaguicidas, como parte de su registro en el país, él dice que prefiere utilizar las publicaciones de los Peer Review Risk Assessments de EFSA, porque establecen claramente los niveles de consumo diario y otros de las especificaciones de los estudios toxicológicos que los respaldan. Ese era un comentario. Veamos por acá qué más tenemos. varios agradecimientos de parte de las diferentes agrupaciones de empresarios de Centroamérica, de diferentes países. Veamos si encuentro acá alguna otra pregunta. El chat ha estado muy activo, tenemos varias mini debates entre los mismos asistentes dentro del chat. Y veamos qué más. Veo mucho, pero más...
Si me permites, Alejandra.
Adelante, Joaquín, por favor.
Yo sugeriría, ya que yo entiendo que, y bueno, eso ya cuando saquemos las conclusiones creo que lo reafirmaremos, pero ya que el tiempo apremia y supongo que, sobre todo, lo digo porque en Bruselas tener conciencia que en Europa estamos a última hora de la tarde del viernes, con lo cual todos tendríamos ganas de empezar nuestro fin de semana. Yo, ya que Hermine se ha ofrecido, yo sugeriría que, bueno, podemos acabar de contestar alguna pregunta ahora, pero sí que nos ofrecemos la posibilidad de a lo mejor recopilar una serie de preguntas y comentarios, que yo también he estado siguiendo el chat y la verdad es que el debate ha sido intenso. Recopilar una serie de preguntas de cosas que no hayan quedado claras o de preguntas importantes e intentarlas responderlas por escrito en algún momento, con lo cual, bueno, nosotros lo discutiremos internamente con Hermine y con Luis y luego lo podemos hablar contigo cómo podemos realizar eso y hacer difusión de esas respuestas, porque yo
Excelente.
creo que no vamos a poder contestar a todas las preguntas.
No. Estoy un poco abrumada viendo la cantidad de preguntas, pero creo que hemos hecho un esfuerzo por respetar los tiempos. De parte nuestra, pues agradecerles absolutamente a ustedes el hecho de trabajar en sus últimas horas laborales de un viernes en este tema. Nosotros, por otro lado, estamos iniciando, así que estamos fresquitos y con muchas ganas de aprender y conocer. Pero creo que hemos cumplido con creces el objetivo de la actividad y el objetivo que nos planteamos dentro de nuestro subcomité de medidas sanitarias y fitosanitarias. Hemos contado con la participación de más de 200 personas de toda la región centroamericana. Les estaremos haciendo llegar también a ustedes el registro de los participantes para que del lado europeo puedan sentirse también muy satisfechos cuando vean la cantidad de participación que logramos desde asociaciones, empresas privadas, registrantes, operadores económicos, hasta participación de todas las instituciones. Así que ha sido, de parte nuestra, lo valoramos como una actividad absolutamente exitosa. Nos motiva para la próxima, que tenemos el 27 de octubre, sobre el Pacto Verde y la estrategia de la granja a la mesa. Y bueno, me encanta también ver a Cristina en pantalla. Cristina, y veo tu manita levantada, no sé si quieres hacer algún comentario, siempre muy bien recibida por tus compañeros centroamericanos. Adelante, Cristina, por favor.
Gracias. Además de saludar y permitidme que dé las gracias a mis compañeros en Parma, en la EFSA, la verdad es que apreciamos muchísimo el esfuerzo que habéis hecho y os lo agradecemos. Y a vosotros también agradeceros, ha sido súper intenso y también permíteme que diga divertido seguir el chat. He visto las preguntas, las respuestas, el chat y bueno, en algún momento he hecho un pequeño comentario. He visto que hay una gran preocupación después de que Hermine presentara la cuestión del Codex, que suscitaba mucho debate ahí. Entonces quería dar un par de datos que creo que siempre un poco ilustran. Parece que nosotros nos desviáramos continuamente del Codex. Nuestro alineamiento con el Codex es del 70%, para que nos hagamos una idea. En los países de la OCDE tenemos el mayor nivel de alineamiento con el Codex. Creo que esto es importante decirlo, porque si no parecería que todos nuestros MRLs se divierten del Codex, cuando no es así. En un 70% estamos alineados y esto es importante decirlo. Aparte, por supuesto, subrayar el derecho de establecer cada uno nuestro límite de consumo, nuestro límite máximo de ingesta de residuos que pueden estar presentes. Creo que además también, y como se decía en el chat, el alimento no es el mismo, no tenemos la misma dieta, no consumimos de la misma manera. Es lógico entonces que estos elementos se tengan en cuenta y que por tanto no seamos exactamente, no tengamos los mismos. Ya sé que para el agricultor, como se decía en algún momento en el chat, puede ser complejo hacer distintos productos para según qué mercado. Bueno, yo ahí solamente puedo aconsejarle que lo hagan para el mercado más exigente, que el que cumple lo max cumple lo menos. Así que, bueno, es una sugerencia. Otro pequeño dato que quería dar también, porque creo que también es importante, cuando se habla de las tolerancias a la importación, en nuestros datos más o menos hasta el 2018, de unas 94 solicitudes que recibimos para tolerancias a la importación, 80 recibieron una evaluación positiva. Su conclusión fue que se acordó dar esta tolerancia a la importación y hubo 9 que recibieron una opinión negativa. Hay 5 de las que no sé exactamente todavía cómo han quedado, pero quiero decir que el sistema, tal y como lo presentan mis colegas, porque lo han presentado entero, completo, dando todos los detalles, con mucha transparencia, pero puede dar lugar a la idea de que, 1, nos desviamos del Codex y 2, no admitimos tolerancias a la importación y somos muy restrictivos. Bueno, yo creo que estos datos ilustran un poco sobre la realidad de la situación. Nada más, daros las gracias a todos y desearos un buen día allá y una buena tarde, una buena noche acá. Hasta luego.
Gracias, Cristina. Nuevamente veo muchísimos agradecimientos en el chat. Lo que queremos es exportar más a la Unión Europea. Centroamérica quiere exportar cada vez más, cada vez productos con mayor valor agregado. Y para eso es fundamental conocer las regulaciones. Y entonces creo que tenemos que seguir conversando, Cristina y Joaquín. Tenemos que seguir en estos intercambios, conociéndonos mejor. Sí, Cristina.
Alejandra, yo creo que la cuestión no es exportar más, es exportar mejor. Es lo mismo que queremos nosotros hacia Centroamérica, exportar mejor. Por la salud de nuestras poblaciones y del medio ambiente.
Exportar más y mejor y conocer cada vez mejor las regulaciones de la Unión Europea para garantizar que vamos a continuar pues aprovechando los beneficios de este acuerdo región-región que tenemos vigente entre nosotros. Bueno, yo pues de mi parte no me queda más que agradecer, le agradezco muchísimo a Johnny Paz, que ha sido nuestra mano derecha a nivel técnico. Él es de Procomer, pero se apunta 100% con la camiseta de Comex para hacer este evento pues con la mejor calidad desde el punto de vista logístico y técnico. Le agradezco muchísimo a Roxana, que nos ha ayudado con la interpretación. Nosotros, de parte del Ministerio de Comercio Exterior de Costa Rica, pues en la mayor disponibilidad siempre de trabajar en la coordinación para traer estos eventos a la región centroamericana. Y Joaquín, veo tu mano levantada, te doy la palabra y creo que ya con esto podríamos concluir.
Sí, gracias Alejandra. Precisamente para cerrar un poco de nuestro lado, yo en primer lugar, bueno, aparte de agradeceros mucho a vosotros la organización del evento y la logística, yo creo que ha funcionado perfectamente. Nosotros nos damos muy satisfechos también del evento. Tú has mencionado que ha habido alrededor de 200 participantes, por lo cual yo francamente no esperaba tanta afluencia. Me gustaría también felicitar a mis colegas de la EFSA por sus presentaciones excelentes y completas. Yo creo que han correspondido a las expectativas y probablemente incluso más de las expectativas. Con lo cual, mis felicitaciones y mis gracias a Hermine y a Luis respecto a eso. Yo creo que hemos hecho un esfuerzo, esperamos que hayamos cumplido con el objetivo, que era aportar un poquito más de luz sobre lo que hay detrás de la autorización de sustancias activas y determinación de MRLs en la Unión Europea. Yo creo que hemos aportado evidencia de que no es un proceso arbitrario, que no es un proceso singular de protección, sino que simplemente detrás, como habéis visto, hay una enorme cantidad de trabajo y de datos y de evaluación y de sentido común para conseguir ese objetivo político, es cierto, de protección de la salud del consumidor. europeo. Y también habéis visto que estamos involucrados a nivel internacional. Cristina ha dado los datos sobre Codex y sobre tolerancias a la importación, con lo cual también estamos intentando contradecir ese argumento de que la Unión Europea se desvía de los estándares internacionales. Y nada más, satisfecho por la capacitación, esperamos que haya sido útil y seguimos a vuestra disposición y seguiremos con las discusiones a nivel de subcomité. Muchas gracias.
Buenos días y buenas tardes. Gracias. Hasta luego.
Thank you again, and it was really a pleasure.
Thank you, Germán and Luis.
Thank you, gracias.